Hey, welcome back to the Shed Books channel. I haven't done a little video in a hot minute, so I thought I'd get back to it. I've read some curious things. This is like a kind of a back to the curious the curiosities video series. I wanted to highlight some of these things that I read. Every couple years I do a trip to Powell's. So we take like a 16-hour drive, and every couple of years we'll go to Portland and just do a book haul. And it's kind of been I've done it 3 or 4 times. Every time I go, you just spend a couple days just going through the entire shop. Uh, you know, it's something of a book destination for many people, myself included. And kind of going through those shelves, in different years, I've come across these ones. So apologies in advance for not being able to ever pronounce French last names. I'm gonna go with Legault. I could be wrong. Uh, on my first trip to Powell's, I picked up, not my first, a previous trip, I picked up Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror 2 by Paul Legault. And then in a later trip, picked up Lunch Poems 2 by the same author. These are curious in that they are books of poetry that have this sequel number on the end of them. They are poetry sequels of two of the most beloved poetry collections in 20th century letters. Two of the kind of probably what I would probably deem the two largest, most treasured titles of the New York School. If you're not familiar with the New York School, just kind of I'm no scholar, but I'll do just kind of like a little bit of tidbit history. Uh, New York School was a movement of poets and then also visual artists at the time that they kind of were grouped together in a number of ways. Almost, I always see them sort of as like a East Coast juxtaposition of what the Beats were doing. So, like, also in the 50s, you're probably more familiar with the Beats. Thematically, the Beats would be people who would far more focused on like freedom, their own poetic genius, jazz. There's always there's like a macho element to what they do as well. Uh, you know, Ginsberg probably like the outlier in that sense, being the gay one and the best of the bunch. But kind of the New York School was sort of the opposite of that in some ways. They were far more colloquial. The drugs they took were different. They were more focused on like the city and friendship and more often more, I don't know, internal type questions. So in categorizing like the New York School, many of them were gay men, and a lot of that is explicit, but subtle. Like they're still talking about their lives and their friendships in that sense, but they were never ones to go blue. But they were also unabashed about it, so that's always something that I appreciated as a reader of the New York School stuff. In reading them both, as a young man, really identifying with the Beats and kind of like loving that idea of just getting on the road, finding freedom, kind of just like following your muse and just putting it on the page. But in my later years, I'm certainly more charmed by what the New York School would do. In particular, Frank O'Hara would be my favorite. This collection in particular, Lunch Poems, is largely kind of what it is, right? It's poems that he wrote during his lunch breaks. They'll often just be about friends and going to movies and walking through the New York streets. And don't want to use charming as a negative term, but like I think it's charming. His voice is very present. I love it. So on the flip, Ashbery's self-portraited convex mirror, uh, probably the one of the more enduring figures coming out of the New York school. Uh, he and this was kind of like his first like prominent rise. Eventually winning uh, the Pulitzer Prize and any number of other National Book Awards and things like that. Certainly the one with the most credentials. So, in discovering these two titles, I was kind of blown away by the audacity of doing such a thing. Writing a sequel to, or two sequels to the most, like some of the most treasured collections of poetry that the 20th century has produced. And so, yeah, really taken by that. In his introduction, Legault states, Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror 2 is a memory translation. I wrote down each of Ashbery's original poems from memory. There's no way that could possibly be true, even just to know, like, structurally how he did it here. Of the two, Self-Portrait 2 is the more successful of the bunch. He absolutely captures Ashbery's tone, voice so much better in this one. This one I felt like a very knowing, loving, smart tribute to the original text, but obviously putting himself quite into this one. Lunch Poems 2, I think, is less successful, does not quite. O'Hara has a very colloquial voice, one that's very talky. I don't think he quite hits that, especially if we're talking about like translation from memory, really just trying to, put down these poems from memory. To me, some of the most memorable lines from O'Hara, I think you'd be able to like do a lot with restructuring and, doing poetic takes on what he did previously. And I think that's kind of a little more absent in this one. All that to say, I thought these were a very cool concept to do for a poetry collection. Very audacious. I love, the idea to do it, to take on your heroes and try to do them justice. I think is like an interesting move. Obviously, these are small press, like beautifully bound from both these presses. What's this one? This was done by Fence Books. I did really search for this one. This was by Sport Books. I'd recommend them. They were cool, and ultimately they got me to reread. I did read them kind of side by side, admittedly, and not to it's judging it pretty harshly to be like, oh, it's not as good as the the previous masterpiece. But I think that's not the point. It's as a construction for the writer to use this conceptual form that these giants have placed before you, and kind of like how do you work within that as an artist, as a writer. I think that's a very interesting mode to do a poetic book for. To kind of do it twice, to do it to like live in another artist's au revoir, and then kind of make an artistic statement out of that is, I don't know, it's an interesting mode. And I mean, obviously that's trying to pinpoint why that is interesting is just like kind of the point of this video itself. Just the gall to do a poetry sequel to Lunch Poems and Convex Mirror is quite the move. So Salute to Legault. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. Uh, they're cool. And then, as a side note, as a sort of side recommendation to all that, kind of the complaint about not quite capturing the voice of O'Hara in Lunch Poems 2. Just as a personal, like, kind of side favorite, if you can ever track them down, find David McFadden's books. This is only just a couple I've got here. Hamilton Poet, kind of, but I would, in my estimation, very influenced by O'Hara and his style. But instead of kind of taking on New York City, takes on his city of Hamilton. So there's kind of a little Canadian bent to it, but it's the voice is similar. The kind of focus on friends and family, like your city and the surroundings. I think if you like O'Hara, you'll find a lot in, especially the kind of earlier McFadden books. Just personal favorite. And then on the other side, just if we're talking about more New York School, you can't go wrong with Joe Brainerd. Lunch Poems is probably my favorite, but the work of Joe Brainerd has that voice as well. Very spoken, very just kind of putting down thoughts, but funny. It's like just bringing you into a world, not taking themselves too seriously. Obviously, if you can ever just track down the one, I Remember by Joe Brainerd is just a wonderful construction of how to put together a book, and has had many derivatives and people who've used his form of I Remember, and still none of them, even Georges Perec, and still none of them quite match like the joy and charm and invitation that Brainerd gives you. So I would, if you love that kind of stuff, poetry that's not too self-serious, but not too jokey, but personal and loving, Brainerd, it's great. So shout out to Legault for attempting this poetic mode, and considering this type of work and working in poetry in a different way. I like the concept. Hopefully that wasn't too much for everybody, but finding discoveries in bookstores is what it's all about. And hopefully this is like some invitation into you discovering some great poetry that I really like, and I want to share it with you. So there you go. Goodbye. Read.